Okay, we are now recording. So thank you everyone and welcome to the second symposium of the economics of well-being and global human flourishing. So again, we are based in the Harvard Human Flourishing Network, which is housed in the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. Thank you all for being here. And today we are going to talk about voices from policy and practice. And so how do we take the research on economics, on human flourishing from social sciences, from psychology, from economics, and from organizations, and how do we translate those into useful policies and actions that transform not only individuals and organizations, but society as a whole? And so this initiative is part of a movement. You'll hear a lot more about that through Kelsey, Amanda, Emmie, and Bonita. And I will introduce them quite shortly. A little bit about myself again, if you missed it. I'm a senior fellow for the Harvard Human Flourishing Network, and I chair the working group on the economics of well-being and global human flourishing. And what we aim to do is really anchor measurement and redefine what it is that we're valuing as a society in our institutions and organizations, and making economics a field that is more accessible to the people. And so we're going to talk about research and we're going to talk about policy, but we're also going to talk about practice and conversations with your families and making this something that is household conversation, and that people understand what it is that we value fundamentally and how we measure it. And what we measure really matters and is powerful. And so if you're familiar, the Harvard Human Flourishing Program is also really instrumental in one of the largest research studies on human flourishing to date, in partnership with Baylor University and Gallup, aiming to measure the worldwide human flourishing of many, many nations. And that project is well underway. So stay tuned for more on that. And if you'd like to hear more, you can go back to our inaugural symposium and listen to Tyler Van der Weel's speech on that. And so that was an amazing event. Many of you made it. Again, thank you so much for being here. And I want to take a moment to thank our director of the network, Matthew Lee. So Dr. Professor Matthew Lee is an amazing, amazing leader, scholar, and friend. Many of you are nodding, and he couldn't be with us today because he's at Templeton in the Bahamas right now. And, we're so grateful that he has created the space for us to come together with our creativity and pursue truth in the company of friends. And so with that spirit, I'd like to shortly introduce everybody. But basically now more than ever, we can see that going beyond traditional methods of evaluating welfare for society, good health and well-being is really necessary, particularly when it comes to evaluation of well-being, policies and practices. We know that measures such as GDP and QALYs are quite insufficient in looking at the full perspective of what it means to be human and what it means to be flourishing individually, but also collectively in communities in our society. And so again, this movement is towards an economics for the people, as opposed to people working for economics. And Amanda will speak more about that. And so this event is sponsored also with the Institute for Global Flourishing, the Harvard Human Flourishing Network, and the Global Shapers Initiative, New York City, Manhattan hub of the World Economic Forum. So if you want more information, feel free to email me. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce my fellow senior fellow, Emmie Bidston. And Emmie is amazing. She is going to really anchor this for us today. And she is an associate fellow of the Oxford Character Project, a senior fellow with us here at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program's Flourishing Network. She's an economist who teaches in high school, and she has co-authored an award-winning book with our other senior fellow, Dr. Katie Granville Chapman, which is Leader, Know, Love, and Inspire Your People. Emmie, should you kick us off?
Thank you so much, Noemi.
Thank you.
Look, it's a real privilege to be here with you all. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to come out and say that I'm feeling pretty insecure because I'm looking around this room and there are some incredible academic economist at some of the top universities in the world. And I'm teaching in the classroom to 17-year-old boys, mostly, a few girls who do economics. So mostly my contribution to this community is leadership for Flourishing, but I am hugely passionate about teaching economics, which I think is why Noemi kindly asked me to contribute. So you are going to hear some kind of like on the edge, amazing academic economics after me, but I'm going to start off with something kind of more grounded. And so I've called this presentation, it will be about 10 minutes. I'm just going to share my screen, talking to my daughter about economics, which for those of you, some of you may recognize, it's the title of a book by Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister. And it's a great book, but it also for me summarized kind of what I was hoping to share with you today. So I do have 3 daughters. They're all in the boat there on the picture, if you can see that. And one of them is studying economics with me at high school at the moment. Luckily, I'm not teaching her. It's quite embarrassing having your mother at school. But I'm having an amazing conversations with her. And I guess that's what I was excited about. If we are going to, we obviously need to change economics at the high level. We need to change our research, and we need to change the conversations at government level. But we also need to talk to our children and re-inspire a new generation about what economics is for. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. I'm just going to work out how to change my screen. Okay, so I studied economics at Cambridge, and I went into economics because I thought it could change the world for good. If you have watched the film The Big Short, there's a great quote where Brad Pitt says, here's a number, every 1% unemployment goes up, 40,000 people die. You know, it's a very generalized statistic, not always right in all circumstances, but it makes the point. Things in economics affect real people's lives hugely, and therefore have a massive impact on flourishing. The Full Monty was an older film, if you haven't watched it, it's set in the UK after the mines were closed by Thatcher, again, all about unemployment. That was more my era. And again, watching it, I thought, do you know what? This matters. This really matters. If we can solve unemployment, we change lives for the better. So I went into economics all excited about using it for flourishing and for the greater good. And then very quickly you come across this picture of economic man. I've got him here standing on the right. And he stands alone. There's nobody else around him. He's got money in his hand. He's got a calculator in his head, ego in his heart, and nature at his feet. And it's just the opposite of everything that we would say humanity was all about. And yet this picture of Homo economicus has been so powerful. It's one of the most important portraits, you could argue, ever created, because it influences policymaking, it shapes the way we talk about ourselves, and it ends up shaping the way we behave. There's been some really fun research. There's a game called the Ultimatum game, where 2 players are given a sum of money, say £10, and the person who's given it is told to offer some of that money to the other person. If the person accepts the amount of money, then you both get to keep it. If they don't, no one gets it. So I've got £10. I might offer Noemi £5, and she'll say, oh yes, I'll have that. And then we both get to keep the £5. If she says no, no one gets it. And they've done this. And, you know, in economic theory, if we are entirely rational, I should offer Noemi 1p, and she'd say yes, because 1p is better than nothing, and I'd get to keep all the rest because I'm selfish. Now, we know that's not how people behave, and all the times they do this, you know, people give, you know, up to a third to a half away because we care about fairness. But what's terrifying is that if you teach people economics, it makes them more selfish. When you do the experiment again, they give less away. So I've gone into studying economics because I want to make the world better. And suddenly I realized that by studying it, we actually create people who are more selfish and care more about money and less about community. So something's gone wrong with economics, and we have got to change it. This is one of my favorite quotes about economics. I love it. This is from talking to my daughter. And it says that ensuring that everyone is allowed to talk authoritatively about the economy is a prerequisite for a good society and a precondition for an authentic democracy. The economy's ups and downs determine our lives. Its forces make a mockery of our democracies. Its tentacles reach deep into our souls, where they shape our hopes and aspirations. If we defer to the experts in the economy, we effectively hand them all the decisions that matter. So we can't run away from economics just because it happens to make us more selfish if we study it. We have to be part of it. We have to equip our daughters and our sons, and we could do with more girls in economics, to be able to grapple with this and talk about it and to think well about economics. And a lesson I love to do at the start with all my students when they first take my course is I make them stand up and run to one side of the classroom or the other, depending whether they agree or disagree with some statements. And so I'm going to put these statements up for you now, and you have to write down whether you agree or disagree with them. In fact, let's put hands up if you agree on your little icons. So put a little yellow hand up if you agree, and keep your hand down if you disagree. Okay, so hands up if you agree, hands down if you disagree. And our first question is, greed is a more significant driver of behavior than altruism. Hands up if you agree, and hands down if you disagree. And Noemi, you might have to look at the hands. I don't quite know how to look at how many hands go up. Great, quite a lot of hands up. Perfect. Okay, hands down again. Next question. Cooperation is better than competition to determine progress and development. So cooperation is better than competition. Hands up if you agree. Hands down if you disagree. Next question. Hands down to agreement, so we're all neutral again. And then hands up if you agree that fairness is more important than freedom in an economy. Fairness is more important than freedom. Next one. For the average citizen, this could be US, UK, wherever you are, more money does not improve their well-being in any meaningful way. Hands up if you agree. Hands down if you disagree. And I make my students run around because they're 17 and they don't run around, they get twitchy in my classroom. Okay, the level of inequality is too high and should be reduced. Hands up if you agree. Hands down if you disagree. And then finally, a person's income accurately reflects the value they create to the society. Hands up if you agree. Hands down if you disagree. I'm just going to get back. So yeah, so thank you for that. So when I did this with my class, my particular class, I'm thinking of at the beginning of this term, I think the whole class said greed's more a significant driver of pain than altruism. Nobody thought altruism was better than greed. Only one student thought cooperation was better than competition. Everyone else said it's competition. 80% said freedom's more important than fairness. 90% thought money did improve your well-being. And inequality was a little bit more split. But I think what's made me think is these guys haven't even studied economics yet. We haven't even made them more selfish. And yet there's something about the way that we have turned from having a market economy to being a market society. So these things that we think, we're telling economists have become the language of everybody, the idea that we are consumers first and foremost. And it has changed the way that we think and what we believe about who humans are. We've become more and more to believe in that picture of Homo economicus and less in what we would believe in terms of flourishing and human dignity and who people really are. So, back. And so look, in economics, but particularly that issue of value, I think is just so interesting. Is it the case that what the market pays is what we value and what the value of something is? And, great minds from Plato to Smith have pondered why water, which is essential for life, is virtually free, and diamonds, which have a limited utility beyond their beauty, are so expensive. Why Amazon's one of the most valuable companies in the world, and yet the value of the Amazon rainforest is not appearing on ledgers. Why tech companies, make billions during the pandemic, but nurses are still striking in the UK for a pay rise at the moment. And if you've watched Breaking Bad, how come you can earn so much making meth compared to being a teacher, when surely being a teacher has more value to society? There's all sorts of paradoxes of value within the market system. And, most of us would believe that, contributions are moral. They are not just the market. The market can't necessarily reflect that. And Mariana Mazzucati, you'll have come across, done some brilliant work on what value means and how we need to rethink our financial systems so that capitalism can be steered towards the sustainable future that we want. Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of England, not anymore, and he had a meeting with Pope Francis from the Vatican and a load of others, looking at how do we kind of rethink about the market. And Pope Francis gave this parable that I thought was quite nice. He said to everybody, our meal will be accompanied by wine. Now, wine is many things. It has a bouquet, colour, and richness of taste that all complement the food. It has alcohol that can enliven the mind. Wine enriches all our senses. At the end of our feast, we will have grappa. Now, grappa is one thing. Alcohol, grappa is wine distilled. Humanity is many things: passionate, curious, rational, altruistic, creative, self-interested. But the market is one thing: self-interest. The market is humanity distilled. And your job is to turn the grappa back into wine, to turn the market back into humanity. This isn't theology, this is reality, this is truth. And Mark has written a brilliant book called Values that kind of delves into this a little bit more. And so I guess I would like to just argue that as we teach economics, as you talk to your children, as I talk to my daughter about economics, I want her to realize that we need to be careful. The market is both wonderful and dangerous, and that putting some things up for sale can corrode the value of what is being priced. The philosopher Sandel has done some good work on this, and he says that when we decide that certain goods and services can be bought and sold, we decide at least implicitly that it is appropriate to treat them as commodities, as instruments of profit and use. And sometimes that in and of itself can erode moral and civic goods. And so I think we really need to think about that. And I would love us therefore to kind of say that we need new stories for economics. We need new visualizations of who we are as humans, of what the market can be. And Kate Romsworth has done some lovely stuff in Donut Economics about this. And I love, Yanis Varoufakis has written a fictional economics book. It's the first economics book I've ever read that is just fiction, called Another Now, Dispatches from Alternative Present, where he takes us into the future and imagines a society that could be different. And again, Rutner Bregman's done some lovely work on a utopia for realists. How do we reimagine what economics could be, what society could be? How do I awaken my daughter's imagination to not just buy uncritically into the neoliberal economics that mostly we get taught at university, although I know we've got other great economists who are teaching it differently. And so I'm going to finish with a quote about storytelling. This actually comes from a fictional book called The Night Circus. And in it, there are a brother and a sister. And one of them is very powerful, and one is just a storyteller. But it's reminding us of why we need to tell stories, even in economics. Someone needs to tell those tales. When the battles are fought and won and lost, when the pirates find their treasures and the dragons eat their foes for breakfast with a nice cup of lapsang souchong, someone needs to tell their bits of overlapping narrative. There's a magic in that. It's in the listener. And for each and every ear, it will be different, and it will affect them in ways that they can never predict. From the mundane to the profound, you may tell a tale that takes up residence in someone's soul, becomes their blood and self and purpose. That tale will move them and drive them, and who knows what they might do because of it, because of your words. That is your role, your gift. Your sister may be able to see the future, but you yourself can shape it. Do not forget that. There are many kinds of magic after all. So I'd like us to embrace the magic of redreaming and reimagining economics and telling new stories that might set up in someone's soul and heart and change the future. And I'm going to stop sharing there. Thank you so much, Noemi. I hope I was roughly to time. I thank you for your wave.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Emmie. So many questions I look forward to resurfacing at the end when we go into our dialogue portion. This was incredible. And we do still have another extra minute. So what I would invite the group to do is to take a contemplative moment and to just sort of close your eyes if you're comfortable and tune into any emotions that are coming up for you, how you're feeling after you take in this content from Emmie. And whenever you're ready, just feel free to type into the chat anything that's emerging for you. You can maybe tune into what is the felt sense that we're coming into when it comes to economics today. And taking a nice deep breath. Emmie, thank you so much. Getting a lot of wonderful comments here. Game changer, hope. Yes, beautiful. All right, so today's session, as you can tell, is going to be a little bit different, and that's what we're going for. A combination of theory, practice, research, and contemplative discussion, dialogue, and practice. So now we are going to transition to Kelsey O'Connor. So Dr. Kelsey O'Connor is a researcher in economics of well-being at StatTech Research. And he is also an editor for the Journal of Happiness Studies. So happiness versus economics, and bringing both of those two together is pretty cool. He also serves on the advisory panel for the UK's What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and is just an incredible human being. So Kelsey, I'm sure you have much more to share, but I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
that kind introduction. A wonderful human being. I feel like I can't live up to that one, especially when I am a selfish economist. But trying to turn grappa back into wine, however, as a happiness economist. I actually just finished a workshop today with other economists and social scientists more generally. And the general consensus among us is that, the happiness group is generally much nicer than the typical set of economists. So it's always a nice time. It's a very different group of people generally. So we need to do more of that in the undergraduate and high school teaching of economics, and just a general understanding. So, but unfortunately for you all, I'm still very traditional. And so I have some figures in here, and some, it's not as colorful as the last presentation, but we'll get right into it. With how to measure and achieve or not achieve societal progress based on some work that I've looked at. So here, I think many of us are led to believe that the world is falling apart, coming from media and other outlets. But if you've read Steven Pinker's book, or you are familiar with it somewhat, he makes the case that we're actually, or the world is not actually falling apart. When you take a longer term perspective, comparing us to the Enlightenment. Here are some quotes. The evidence is overwhelming that life in general has gotten better since the 18th century. Humans are living an additional 40 years. Our lives are also healthier. There's less polio, and wealthier. We have more refrigerators. Extreme poverty levels are at historic lows. More people live in freer societies that engage in fewer and less bloody wars, and have less murderous neighborhoods, drive safer cars, and mix more freely between races, and discriminate less against women and homosexuals. This is a quote from Journal of Economic History. So, I leave it to you, however. What do you think? Are we better off today than we were in the 1700s? And how do you know? So Pinker looked at, if I remember right, it's 72 figures. And that's a lot of information to summarize, when you may have some things that are improving and other things that are not improving. So the focus is initially in this presentation is, how do we know, how do we measure progress? So I'm going to look at first what the United Nations is doing. Going back to the 1990 Human Development Report, we have the following quote: "We are rediscovering the essential truth that people must be at the center of all development. The purpose of development is to offer people more options. One of their options is to access income, access to income, not as an end in itself, but as a means to acquiring human well-being. But there are other options as well. It's not just income." So even in the 1990s, the United Nations knew that people should be at the center of development, not economic markets as we think of today. So somewhere we've gone astray, obviously previous to 1990, but even still, and the focus should be on well-being. More recently, here is the resolution adopted in 2015 by the United Nations on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Some of you will know this is where the Sustainable Development Goals arose from. And here you can see some of what went into that. So they did 2 years of intensive public consultation with civil society and stakeholders from around the world. So I take this as the most authoritative view really capturing people from around the world at various levels of society. And what they developed were these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So those represent progress according to the UN and the various stakeholders. However, this is to be monitored, again, with a very large number of indicators. So this is difficult to summarize, convey by the media and for the public to take in. And especially given that you may have movements in a positive direction for some and negative direction in another, and how do you make sense of that? And it can be manipulated also by policymakers. So I would like to make instead the argument that we can use well-being as a measure. And here is another quote or kind of just a large passage summarizing the results from the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. So they're specifically they were set up to look at social progress. And it was comprised of 25 social scientists, including 6 Nobel laureates in economics. So among those selfish economists, they recommended shifting emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. So we are, again, trying to go back into wine from grappa with this type of statement. And so I make the argument then that we can just go straight to well-being. We don't have to look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals because ultimately the factors in the Sustainable Development Goals are contributing to people's well-being today and in the future. And we need to be able to summarize this information for people to understand. So for this commission, they recommended using both objective and subjective measures of well-being. And many of you are going to be familiar with the distinctions here, but to say a few words, objective variables, right, can be verified by independent third parties, whereas subjective measures are really based on how you feel about things. So the advantage of how you feel about things is you get to decide. So it's very democratic. There's no expert saying you should care about this or shouldn't care about that. You get to decide what's important to you. So life satisfaction is one of the measures I'd like to focus on. So among the subjective well-being measures, economists generally prefer it. It's the response to questions such as the following: all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And I say economists, I should say, it's not the orthodox economists, but the happiness economists. And more recently, Nobel laureate in economics, but a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman. So he's the author of Thinking Fast and Slow. So a well-known guy. Originally had an alternative view on subjective well-being, but more recently said that people don't want to be happy the way I have defined the term. It's much more important for them to be satisfied or to experience life satisfaction. So I'm taking life satisfaction as being the kind of singular dimension that's important. And there are some limitations with using well-being as a measure of progress or subjective or objective indicators. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to cover them in any detail here, but I do mention them in a recent freely accessible policy paper with the Institute of Labor Economics, which is called Measuring Progress. And here, it's just one more quote about having one number. So this is from the originator of the Human Development Report. And also you have another Nobel Prize winner who goes on to confirm this statement shortly afterwards. He says, we need a measure of the same level of vulgarity as GNP, which is like GDP. We just need one number, but we need a measure that is not as blind to social aspects of human lives as GNP. And the argument here is really just, it's important to be able to summarize where we're at and where we're going quickly so that it is being used by people. One reason why GDP is used is because it is a single number and we can focus on that quickly and easily. So then, now that we take well-being, in particular life satisfaction as a measure of progress, how do we achieve it or not achieve it? Some of you will be familiar with the Easterlin paradox. So to define it, it's, for those of you who are unaware, it's the contradiction between two empirical income happiness relationships. We'll just focus on one, the more controversial one. And there it's over time, countries that grow at faster rates, that have higher GDP per capita growth, they do not experience an increase in happiness over time. So a lot of relationships have been based on this since. This was originally done in 1974, but we've had some updates over time. So here is an example of some of those results. So you have the years across the bottom, starting in the early 1970s, and you have an index on the left. And so you can see that over this period of time, GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation, has nearly doubled since the early 70s. So economists would be really satisfied with this and say that our quality of life has improved or nearly doubled over this period of time. We can buy 2 refrigerators for every one before, 2 cars for every one before. But how do people feel about their lives is dramatically different. You can see across the bottom, same type of index, happiness, it's just measured in a similar way as life satisfaction in this case, is basically stable or almost flat over this period. So we've done something wrong from the economics point of view. We're missing important things that contribute to well-being. That was just the United States. We want to take this to a much broader set of countries. And now we have more than 100 countries around the world. So now across the bottom, you have the growth rate in GDP per capita. So a lot of times in the US, it's around 2%. And you hear about countries like China and India, which are towards the middle here, that are growing at exceptionally fast rates. But so this economic expansion, did it lead to improvements in people's well-being or life satisfaction over this long time period from 1981, it's written on the top, over the period 1981 to 2000, I think it's 18. And you can see it is kind of the scatter plot, and it's difficult to make sense of it right now. So what we do, right, is we run regressions and to try to summarize the data. And you could see these lines here as summaries for the different country groups. So we have developed countries, transition countries, less developed countries. So I'll just focus on the less developed one for the moment. They're in triangle, and you have this kind of dashed line right in the middle. It shows a flat relationship, maybe declining somewhat. So Iraq is on the end there actually, but you have India, Nigeria, Korea towards the middle, and you can see that those countries are growing at a faster rate. However, and then you can compare them with on the other side with Mexico and Zambia. They are not experiencing larger growth in life satisfaction over time. And so this is a summary picture to say that the growth rates are not, changes in growth rates are not contributing to changes in life satisfaction. So we're not gaining from growth in terms of life satisfaction like we might have expected. So here, this is just summarizing that greater GDP per capita growth, so this is per person average GDP growth, is not meaningfully associated with greater changes in life satisfaction in the long run. And that includes in the less developed countries, even those that have fewer resources. We describe why this happens in a recent paper. It's just really a chapter on the Easterlin paradox. So you can always find more information there. So then how do you lastingly increase life satisfaction? So there, what you need to do is look at some additional information. And going back to Easterlin, we have a quote that says, full employment and safety net policies do increase happiness. So it's not that it has to be flat or stable over time. And here I draw your attention to 3 studies that I've contributed to. And again, you here just first focus on the fact that all of these lines are upward. And then if you go to the far left, you have social spending across the bottom. So that's expenditures on things like education, health, employment. And then you have subjective well-being, or think of life satisfaction on the left. And so countries that spend more on social expenditures are happier. In the middle, you have European countries during the financial crisis or the Great Recession. And countries that had higher unemployment assistance, so as you move to the right of the figure, those countries had a better time. They were not impacted as much during the Great Recession. On the right, you have Japan over the period 1981 to 2010. And you can see that their progression of life satisfaction, this dashed line, so it's changing over time. It's increased from 1990 to 2010. And very similar progression of the generosity of the welfare state. So at the period of time, they transitioned from more of a family-oriented style of taking care of people to more of a Nordic social democrat style of taking care of their population. So they expanded, and at the same time, life satisfaction expanded. So in general, the generosity of the welfare state program, is positively related to happiness across countries and over time. And here we have another figure. This more recently, we're looking at the trends of happiness in Europe. So from the period 1981, the early 1980s to more recently, 2017, 2018, almost 40 years, you have big changes in life satisfaction. So in Spain, you had improvements, Italy improvements. Whereas if you go to the far right, Denmark and Sweden, although they score quite highly generally, they actually had a decrease in life satisfaction over this period. So then what we try to do is explain this change over time using a few different potential explanations. So first we looked at GDP per capita, it's the standard economic view, but we also looked at air pollution, responding to, in this case, not global warming, but just air quality, really. Social capital, you can think of this as the quality of the social relations in a society. Think about cooperation, which was mentioned in the previous presentation, that would fall into this kind of general category. Also unemployment, which we talked about before as well, and then the generosity of the welfare state programs. So we compared all of these as potential explanations and found that generosity is the only variable for which we find in this case, is a statistically significant relationship with the trend in happiness. Then by statistical significance, I'm referring to let's say it's a reliable, well-explained, a correlation. So concluding, societal progress is marked by increasing well-being, and that can be measured using life satisfaction. This is consistent with the views of the United Nations and is more tractable. It's something that we can actually accomplish and convey to people than the Sustainable Development Goals. And so GDP alone does not contribute meaningfully, if at all, to life satisfaction in the long run. And that includes in the less developed countries. And now we have evidence for that result in more than 120 countries. So it's fairly robust. So then you might ask, how do we improve? How do we improve life satisfaction or generate progress? And in this case, it was the generosity of the welfare state programs. They better explain changes in happiness or life satisfaction than alternatives such as GDP, air pollution, social capital, and unemployment over approximately 40 years. And this was done in 10 European countries. Unfortunately, we don't have the same length of time series in all of these variables to do more than the 10 European countries. So increasing generosity is associated with lasting increases in subjective well-being and or progress. Increasing generosity of the welfare state programs. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Kelsey. We have some questions that came in the chat that we will come back to at the end if you want to take a look from Paul.
Okay.
Yeah, really amazing work. I think what you didn't mention is that Easterlin was your advisor.
Yes, I have had the great opportunity to work with him for now about a decade. And we're writing a book, and he's 97 years old.
Wow.
So he is an impressive individual, and I think it goes to show if you do what you enjoy and you keep your brain active, you can live longer and healthier.
Incredible. Well, I'm sure there are many comments and links to make with the longevity economy there. Thank you so much, Kelsey. So we will come back to this, but now I'd love for you to take another moment and reset your palette, so to speak, before we go to the next speaker. So taking another moment for reflection, you can type into the chat, take a moment to breathe. We have another minute before we get started, and I'm going to introduce Amanda shortly. So just taking a moment to tune in and type any thoughts or comments. So as we're moving through the speakers, how's your thinking and feeling shifting? What insights and questions are coming to you? You have some questions on generosity and social systems, variations in different nations.
Are we allowed to speak not in the chat?
Feel free.
Oh, yeah. I know that you didn't quite have enough time to go through the details, but I'm just curious why the welfare state programs are tied to the increases in happiness. What's the mechanism of analysis there? If that makes any sort of sense.
Thank you, Jacob. So we're going to come back to that. Kelsey, if you want to hold on to that question. So at the very end, just so we can make sure we hear from all speakers. Thank you for that question, Jacob. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering that too. I am. Okay. So now introducing Amanda Janoo. She has an amazing background working in transformation with governments and economic policy. She is the economics and policy lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a collaboration of organizations, government movements, and change makers committed to designing economies that work in the service of people and planet. She has over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Amanda, we're so excited to have you, and I'm glad you are back from Thailand and in the same time zone, because that makes it easier. Thank you for everyone tuning in from around the world. So Amanda, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Really perfect sort of tee up with the other speakers, and I'm feeling really honored to be able to follow those incredible presentations. Because, I'm going to be speaking now a little bit around how do we actually use policy to transform our economic systems or to build a well-being economy. And I think in order to understand how I got into this particular topic, my background, I think, is similar to Emmie. Was, I started studying economics because I saw the world as this Venn diagram with all of these social and political and environmental, cultural, and even spiritual sort of challenges, and felt that somewhere towards the center sat the economy. And if we could change that system, it would ripple out and really improve all these other areas of life. But then I started studying economics, and I was immediately a little bit confused because I realized that there was this assumption by a lot of neoclassical economists that the economy is governed by its own natural laws and not by us, and that it's sort of best to leave it to its own devices, take a hands-off approach, and trust in the self-regulating magical capacity of the markets to lead us to, never-ending prosperity. Now, I should also note that I was studying, my micro, macro intro to economics during the start of the financial crisis. So I had a sneaking suspicion that there might be something off with this logic. And so that really led me to this now decades sort of love-hate relationship with economics, and, a search through the history of economic thought and heterodox economics, political economy, and all of these other ideas to try to really understand what the economy is, but more importantly, how do you change it? And that's what led me to work in industrial policy for a long time with different developing countries around the world, trying to think about how do you proactively transform the structure of your economy in line with development goals. And I think through this whole journey, the one thing I really feel is but I think one of the greatest sort of tricks that's been played on us is to view the economy as this abstract force that's out there beyond our control. So when you Google the term economy, at least for me, this was the first image that came up. And I think that this is really common. We view the economy as, GDP growth rates and stock market values and these abstract indicators, which often present the economy as the most important aspect of life and also the one we can't really do much about. But the reality is that the economy is just the way we produce and provide for one another, right? So we are the economy. And therefore, we always have a right and a responsibility to transform this system in line with our goals and our objectives and our values, because it's a means, it's a method to improve our quality of life. And I think we're lost if we forget that everything we produce comes first and foremost from the earth, and everything we provide is valuable insofar as it contributes to our well-being. And so through my experience, especially working in international development, I came to this realization around how significant it is and how important it is of how we define development. And so around the world, the dominant way in which we define development is through gross domestic product, right? GDP per capita. But when we start with economic indicators, we're always going to be evaluating the economy by its capacity to support itself, right? Not by its capacity to support our collective well-being and our well-being moving into the future. And so starting, I think, as Kelsey was saying, after the financial crisis, there was amongst many leading economists this recognition that GDP is not a good indicator for well-being, let alone even economic performance. And then a real movement by governments who started to recognize that we really can't say that economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is a success, right? If we're seeing environmental crisis, extreme inequalities, huge amounts of instability, the pandemic, and then you put on top of it the fact that people are kind of miserable and lonely, you sort of start asking, what's the point, right? And so Jacinda Ardern, love her, really makes the point well that in order to turn things around, we have to change the way we think, the way we act, and the way we measure, right? And so this is coming also from a recognition, I think, by many governments that we're stuck in this sort of vicious cycle of governments trying to grow the economy as quickly as possible so that they can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix the damages done to people and planet in the process. But they actually don't increasingly have the resources to deal with the increasing severity and frequency of the polycrises we're facing. And so there's a need to move upstream and to really try to think about how we can get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting, right? To proactively sort of design economies that are going to deliver on our social and ecological goals. And this, as usual, right, is not that governments are leading the charge, but it's really a reaction to a shift in public sentiment. So around the world, there's a call for change. And so the majority of people worldwide really believe that our current economic system is doing more than harm than good, and are really losing faith in government as a result. They feel that government is only supporting the interests of the few and not effectively able to respond to the needs of the collective. And beyond this, recent surveys have shown that, at least amongst the G20 countries, the supposed winners of this system, right, the high income countries, 74% of people believe that our economy should work in a way that prioritizes the well-being of people and nature, rather than just solely focusing on increasing profits and wealth. And even in the United States, the statistic is at 68%, right? So there is this shifting recognition that the purpose of the economy needs to be transformed. And that is at the heart of the well-being economy movement. So it's about this recognition that we really need to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy, and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so our sort of vision of a well-being economy is one that starts with different goals, right? That really looks at what are our fundamental needs as humans, and how can we build an economic system which is really designed and evaluated by its capacity to regenerate and support and protect our natural environment, right? Through circular economy or regenerative economy initiatives. How can we ensure that the economy is always evaluated by its capacity to provide everyone with enough, right? To have a sense of dignity and a purpose and the safety and comfort that's needed for happiness and flourishing. And really importantly, how do we build an economy which is fair by design, right? So that, again, we don't always have the government just trying to be the mechanism of redistributing this, but actually utilizing cooperatives and social enterprises and other initiatives to make an economy which is pre-distributive by design, which ensures a fair distribution of voice, power, income, and wealth first time around. And that recognizes our need for connection. Yeah, and I think this is really important. So how do we ensure that we are building an economy that values meaningful and purposeful work, that supports institutions that provide us with our need for trust, and last but definitely not least, how do we build an economy which, unlike ours right now, where people don't feel like they really have a voice over their collective destiny, proactively puts them at the center in terms of determining the type of economic system and its transformation moving forward. And so the Wellbeing Economy movement comes under a lot of different banners. Yeah, so we've heard about some of them here. You know, we've got donut economics and circular economy, solidarity economy, and many more. But what we at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance are trying to do is to bring them all together, to illustrate they're all parts of this piece about this, to move beyond just critique of the current economic system, to illustrate that a different economic system is not only possible, but desirable, that it can be better than the one that we have now. And to ground that in accessible knowledge that illustrates these different ideas and initiatives and thinkers and processes, and all of this to feed new power bases or a movement that can significantly transform our paradigms and our systems at all levels. And I think one of probably the most prominent power bases that we've helped to develop is the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And so one of them being New Zealand, where in the beginning it was New Zealand, Scotland, and Iceland. And so I don't think that it's a coincidence that it was a group of lady leaders who really came together and were saying, we need to redefine what we mean by progress and success. And so all of these governments have developed new indicators, alternative indicators to GDP, which really measure national performance and progress by a set of social and ecological dimensions. And so there are differences amongst all of these different frameworks, but a common, I would say common three sort of areas is that they first of all look at the determinants of well-being, right? So, you know, as Kelsey was saying, looking at life satisfaction, but also at health and housing, education, trust, and other similar indicators. There's also then a consideration of the distribution of that well-being, right? So really thinking about how does these different components vary across gender, race, age, different geographic regions, and other types of demographic groups. And then future well-being, right? So how do we ensure that the well-being of our current generation is not going to undermine the well-being of future generations? And so really placing core significance on air quality and water, biodiversity, conservation, climate, mitigation and adaptation, and also stability and resilience. And so I want to make the point and start with New Zealand, because although the well-being economy movement is really, I would say, moving most rapidly amongst high-income countries, it is not new and it is not our own. So this consideration of what is required to live a good life, to live in harmony with oneself, others, and our natural environment, really heralds from indigenous paradigms and philosophies like Buen Vivir, Swaraj, Ubuntu, or in the case of New Zealand, they spent a long time when developing their well-being framework, engaging with the Maori indigenous community in New Zealand to ask them about what is their conception of well-being, what does that look like? And so the image on the left is a diagram which places spirit at the center, and the green being the earth, right? So the earth as a foundation, the source of all of life. And then the red being society and the different dimensions of empowerment that are needed in society. And then the blue layers really being about what are principles of good governance and decision-making needed in order to support that harmony and collective well-being for generations to come. And so that ended up helping to inform the ways in which New Zealand ended up articulating their well-being framework, but it was also very influenced by the OECD's living standards framework. So we can get into that, but a little bit too much detail. Now, the next government I would want to talk about, and this is my personal sort of favorite example, is from Wales, because Wales went through a process of asking their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And through that process of public consultation, they came up with these 7 well-being goals, and they sort of cross-referenced them with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they created this higher level set of ambitions, right? Of an idea of what it would really mean to be successful in the future. And they passed a legislation, which is called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And what it did was it required all government agencies to work towards the achievement of those goals, to set simple and intuitive indicators, to monitor progress, and to set clearer objectives aligned with those goals. And really critically, and this is the big thing, is that they recognized it required a different system of governance altogether and a different kind of mindset. And so these 5 ways of working, as they say. So it requires government to take a longer term perspective, right? To stop just reacting to crises and to really think about, okay, how do we prevent them from happening in the first place? How do we think multi-generationally? And then to also recognize that it had to break down silos, the traditional silos across government agencies and ministries, and to ensure greater collaboration, but also participation and involvement amongst people in their achievement. And it also resulted in the development of a Wales Future Generations Commissioner, whose goal is to support with this governance reform and also to represent the voices of generations who have yet to be born. The next example, and I think that this is going to be a cool tee up for our next speaker as well, comes from Iceland, because they passed a legislation around gender mainstreaming. And part of that was around gender budgeting. And what was really interesting in that work was that by taking the value of equity, and in this sense, gender equity, they went through a multi-year process and they realized that, beyond just the macro indicators, the system of budgeting and the system of accounts that they had were fundamentally gendered in nature, because physical infrastructure like roads and tunnels and bridges, et cetera, is viewed as an investment, whereas social infrastructure like health and education and things like this is viewed as an expenditure. But men have traditionally been the ones who have worked in physical infrastructure and women in more social infrastructure. And so there was some fundamental gender dimensions to that accounting assumptions. And so work to transform that in order to redefine what an expenditure or an investment is, in order to be able to pass much more progressive gender legislation than would have been viewed as costly in the past. And so I know I don't have a ton of time, so I'll just speak quickly about Canada, because this is, I think, taking the whole well-being, the budgeting work to the next level. So they've developed this well-being framework, which has all of these different headline indicators. But what they've done now is requiring every department, when they're submitting their budget proposals, to really illustrate how it's going to contribute to these different headline indicators and in what way. And so you can imagine it's a very new process. There's definitely some issues here, but the fact that they're have, for example, meaning and purpose, right, as a core goal to help people to think through how would we evaluate the impact of our programs around those types of indicators is quite a huge shift from the way we've been doing it previously. And so I will say, that all sounds good, but there's also challenges that in working with these governments, I think one of the major issues we're facing is that we're trying to elevate the social and the environmental to the level of the economic, right? As opposed to downgrading the economy and recognizing it's just a part of society, which is embedded within a larger ecosystem. And why that matters is because, working with Finland, for example, they're still trying to make the case for why health is good for the economy, as opposed to swapping that burden of proof and saying, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our health, right? What kind of information would we need about the economy in order to do that? And so I'm hoping that this group, because you're working on quantitative methods, might be able to support us with this. But I would say one thing that's giving me hope is a lot of the participatory policy design revolution that's sort of happening around the world. So Spain had a recent Citizens Assembly on climate. And by starting with the highest level sort of goals around our environment, they asked 100 randomly selected citizens to develop a strategy for this. And the kind of strategies that came out were incredible, right? It was around circular economy and regenerative agriculture, synergies around immigration and rural population, dimensions and ecosystem restorations. And it illustrates that people can think in systems. And when we start with those higher level goals, we then allow space to dive into the economic transformation that is needed to achieve them. And so I'll just end by putting a little shout out to our Wellbeing Economy Policy Design Guide, which is co-created by our membership to really help any interested policymakers to think through the process, the how do we go about instigating these processes of not only developing, but internalizing new visions of progress. How do we go about expanding our understanding of what the economy is and can be? How do we develop policies to actually transform systems as opposed to just maintain them? And how do we do this all in a way that's genuinely context appropriate, participatory, and bottom up? And how do we do this in a way that allows space for learning and adaptation? Because there's always more that can be learned from just as much from success as failure. And so with that, I would just say thank you. And if you're interested, I hope you'll join the Wellbeing Economy Alliance.
Amanda, thank you so much. I'm seeing hand claps and comments, and I'm getting so many lively, engaged commentaries and interest for more. So thank you for sharing this. I have many, many thoughts and questions. But before we go on to our next and final speaker, I'd like to give everyone a moment to type in any thoughts or reflections and to just process the session. I love how you emphasize the indigenous wisdom and how oftentimes we have to go back to our our ancient sort of family traditions and the insights that have been passed down for generations with a spirit of respect to guide what many of us think should be common sense, right? And what it means to be human, but we need reminders. And you pointed to the Maori traditions, and it reminded me of this beautiful concept they have on Tarangawawe, which is this place to call home, like a place to set your feet. And so I'm just really grateful for you all in this community for being a space for us to collectively plant our feet and connect globally, wherever we may be, with the ancient wisdom and modern research, and to scale this kind of transformative work. So thank you so much, Amanda, and everyone. Fantastic. Okay, so of course this recording will be posted. We have more people who are still joining and others who have to hop off. So yes, we're getting lots of commentary. Thank you so much, everyone. And yes, I will reference those sources. So our next speaker, this final session, will be a bit more of a fireside chat. We won't be doing any PowerPoints, but we'll be having a discussion to anchor the work, first from conversations with our daughters, to the research, to the policy frameworks, and now to what leaders can do. So if you are a leader in organizations, or you partner with organizations, or you're designing policy interventions, this section is for you. So I'd like to introduce my really good friend and colleague, Dr. Bonita Thompson. And Bonita has spent 30 years in corporate human resources. She managed the development of the very first intranet. Think about that. She's an author of a New York Times bestselling book. And she is going to talk about and anchor our systems when it comes to accounting. So we're going to have a lively discussion on something you might not normally find engaging, but is really important nonetheless. So today we are going to talk about GAAP. So Bonita, would you like to tell us a little bit about what GAAP means?
Sure, I would love to. As you were saying, Noemi, you said that measurement matters, and the measurements that we have in systems really matter. If we want people to be more inclusive, if we want them to focus more on well-being, if we want them to worry about climate change, we have to look at the underlying systems that reward and incentivize certain behaviors. I started my career as an industrial psychologist. I'm now a coach of executives. And so I look at if an executive is having a particularly difficult behavior pattern, I look at what are the incentives that create that behavior pattern and how can we change those. And so when you, Noemi, and I were having a conversation about these incentives, I just wanted to share this with the group and get input from each of you as to what your thoughts are about the incentives that cause leaders to either behave well or behave badly. And so if what we want is for them to consider the human being, first we have to look at how is the human being measured in our corporations. And so I've got some questions for you.
Before you jump into those questions, Bonita, will you tell us what GAAP stands for?
Okay, GAAP is generally accepted accounting principles, and I'll go into the history of GAAP in a little bit. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about what are the two main documents in the financial accounting systems, because not everybody's familiar with accounting if they're doing economics and vice versa. So generally, when you are running your books for your home, what are expenses? Are they good things or bad things? If you can put that in chat.
Type in the chat.
Yeah.
Most
Do you like
people
expenses?
try to minimize them. They try to cut.
You try
costs.
to minimize an expense. Yeah. So, and what do you do with an asset? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's an investment.
It's things that you invest in, right? It's things that you take for the long term that you want to nourish and improve. And so I would ask you on the financial statements, what are people? Are people the greatest asset that a company has, or are people the greatest expense that a company has?
Okay, we're just going to let people type into the chat. Any thoughts there? Yeah, so Bonita, what do you think? What did you learn? So I'm hearing both. Paul says both.
Okay. Well, actually, people are an expense. Basically, we represent people based on their salaries, and that comes on the income statement as an expense. And this is why, we get to the end of the year and we decide that we have to lay everybody off just before Christmas, because we want to minimize those expenses. We want to increase revenues. And as a result, people being an expense, we get rid of them. And so it's a huge problem. And it's also a problem in the sense that, the equipment that the person is working with is considered an asset in generally accepted accounting principles, but the person themselves is an expense. So we want to increase the equipment that they're working with, invest in the equipment that they're working with, but the person themselves is an expense we want to minimize. And that's a huge problem for our economy and for increasing the well-being of people in organizations. So what happens when we treat people as an expense? We see layoffs, cutting of costs. We avoid training because that's an expense on top of an expense. Why would we do that? And any manager who is trying to invest in training is going to be punished economically by the board. So it's really important that we look at how we account for the human being in the corporation. If people were an asset, then we would want to invest in them. Our shareholders would be able to see if we were losing a lot of these assets. Management would be responsible for the effective use and management of the assets. And so you can see if we could change our employees from being expenses to being assets, there would be a tremendous shift in the behavior of boards, in the behavior of leaders, and in the behavior of our governments, because they would be monitoring and seeing. I wrote a paper about this called How to Keep Your Shareholders in the Dark. And it was basically focused on the most important, most creative, most vital part of our corporations are considered expenses, and we invest in them and then we throw them away at come Christmas time. So it's a huge problem in how we run our companies. So I wanted to talk about how did this get started? What's the history of GAAP?
Bonita, before you jump in, we have some questions coming in, and I'd just like to make a comment. It's really fascinating because we're talking about human resources. And of course, we've seen shifts in the way that we view human beings from utilitarian as resources to be expended versus investments and a more humanistic approach to organizations and management. And so Kelsey is asking us, can we capitalize the investments that we make in people?
Oh, that's an excellent question that I am going to get to. But first, I want to talk about the history of GAAP, because then we'll see why this is the way it is. And then we'll go into how we change it. Does that work for you, Kelsey? Okay.
Yeah. So how did this originate? Tell us about this history, Bonita.
So after the Depression, Congress wanted to find a way in which we could stabilize the accounts and be more accurate in our accounting to shareholders, so that the shareholders wouldn't lose everything like happened in the 1930s. And so they set up the generally accepted accounting principles. And so when I talked to my father about the generally accepted or what happened in the 30s, he told me about how his father, my grandfather, would wait in line for work that day. He would go down to the factory, he would wait in line. If he got selected, the family had dinner. If he didn't get selected, the family went hungry. And that was the reality that my father grew up with. And so in this type of economy where people are plug and play, you just bring one in, throw the other one out, the other one gets sick, too bad for them. That was where GAAP was written, and that's why we see it as people as an expense. But life went on. We entered the information age. All of a sudden, employees have vital information that we need. Just certain employees have vital information that we need. We have a systems architect who knows everything about how our systems work. We have a salesperson who knows everything about hundreds of customers. And all of a sudden, in our effort to minimize expenses, we let these people go. And we've just let go the knowledge of our customers or our systems or whatever that employee had in their head. And this is a huge problem for us in the information age. But GAAP stood still. FASB stood still. They didn't change the accounting, and it has caused a tremendous problem. We are seeing that problem today. I'm still, sorry, going to be getting to the solution soon, but we are seeing that problem today in the inflation of our economy. So we see inflation going up. And in my lifetime, all inflation was caused by excess demand. And so the Fed would reduce or increase interest rates in order to reduce demand, and that should take care of the situation. But today we have a little different problem because of the pandemic. Today, our inflation is caused by lack of resources for materials and lack of staffing. And so we're really on the supply side. And so when the Fed starts increasing interest rates to stifle the economy so that we can not have such high inflation, then it's going to only hurt the economy more, because what's really causing this is a lack of staffing. We don't have anybody who's going to increase their expenses by training people, because there's no incentive to do that. And so we're actually harming the economy through this method. So let's talk a little bit about solution, being that we have 5 minutes left. So I was trying to think about how do we embrace this? And one technique would be to have our boards required to look at human resources information, turnover, hire rates, training rates, so that our boards would at least be informed. Right now, our boards and our shareholders are completely uninformed about these issues. But a larger one would be to actually have employees show up on the balance sheet as an asset and a liability. And the best way that I could think of to do that would be to have them put on the balance sheet just the way we put on a lease. So GAAP didn't want people to be owned by a company, and I agree with that. That's a great logic. We don't want to own people, so we can't put them on our balance sheet. But we can put their talent, we can lease their talent, and then have an asset and liability ledger on it. This would require changing GAAP, changing the international accounting standards, and organizations would have to do it all at once, because we would need that in order to compare between different companies. So it would have to be a global effort, but at least recognizing that we have this systemic problem that is in the way of flourishing and supporting employees is, I think, the first step in helping to solve it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bonita. So we're getting some lively comments in the chat. Yelena is saying, yes, it's a sectoral supply side shock rather than excess demand. Exactly. Fantastic approach. My question for you is, as we are seeing ESG and corporate social responsibility sort of critiqued and very much in the spotlight today, what role, if any, can it play to having more flourishing, sustainable organizations? And how do we shift the needle in that direction? How do you transform such a fundamental system as our accounting standards internationally?
So you're asking if the accounting system could be changed to look at environmental issues. Is that?
I think so. When we think of corporate social responsibility, often we're thinking about the environment, but we forget that people are also part of the environment. So like Amanda mentioned, we think about the environment as bigger and economics within it serving the whole. And so if we look at it from that angle, do you see CSR and ESG standards as inclusive of human flourishing standards? And is that an area of opportunity for organizations to start to make this kind of shift? Or does it have to start somewhere else? Where are your thoughts? How do we actually gain momentum here?
Well, that's a wonderful question for my daughter, who's currently writing a book on this topic of how do we incentivize business people to do more environmental actions and to improve the environment. And her premise, the premise of her book is that by having the constraint of different environmental standards, that business people will actually be more innovative and end up profiting more, because the more efficient use of resources within the company will increase the profits. And she has all sorts of examples of this in her book. So I think we need to stop thinking of it as, environmental programs cost us money, instead of seeing it as environmental programs are going to actually benefit our accounting, because it's going to increase profits, because we're going to reduce the use of resources.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing from you, Bonita, is that we need to shift our focus on costs to the root of investing in people.
And in our environment.
Definitely. Wonderfully put. So thank you so much for those points and you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of insights and nudges to share with the accounting community. So a different side of economics here, grounded in an organizational perspective. Thank you so much. So what we are going to do, we have lots of thoughts and questions coming up in the chat. So I want to give everybody a moment to sort of collect your thoughts from this wide variety of perspectives, both the anchored family educational perspective, the researcher perspective, policy, the organizational perspective, and what questions are you left with today? What feelings, emotions, sentiments, or reflections are coming to you? And we'll just give everybody a moment, just a minute, to type that into the chat. Great, I'm seeing hope, more hope. Some aspirational statements. And then we are going to open it up now to address some of the questions that have come up. So any burning questions, please feel free. All right, everyone. So let's go back to some original thoughts and questions. Our first question that came up, I believe, was from Paul. Paul, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions? You had a couple early on.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great. Thanks.
Okay,
Paul.
thanks. This was back to Kelsey's presentation, and I admire the way that it's important to look to a single measure, and happiness and life satisfaction is a good measure, perhaps. But I wonder if anybody on the team, Kelsey, or folks that you've been working with, have looked at some of the other domains of the Human Flourishing Index that Emmie and the team from Harvard have looked at. In particular, some of the data shows that meaning and purpose, for example, correlates at 0.932 with happiness and life satisfaction, more so even than close social relationships and mental and physical health and so on. And that material and financial stability only correlates at a 0.33. So it's much lower. And anyway, so I just wanted to check and see if anyone has done the analysis. Some of the graphs you showed were fascinating, and I wonder if there's maybe another story there. You mentioned that the only link that the team found was with the generosity of the welfare state, but maybe there are other factors going on as well that are subcomponents of the Human Flourishing Index.
Yes, thanks, Paul. I'll try to answer quickly just to give more space for more questions. So meaning and purpose, kind of represents a different concept of well-being, and you can think of it as flourishing. So I'm on board. I like that. The challenge is that it's probably an echo. We don't have the same time dimension for these types of measures. So with the life satisfaction question, we go back to the 1980s. And with the the meaning and hope question, we don't have it in the same time dimension or in the same number of countries. So I also think that meaning, and maybe I said hope earlier, I was thinking about that, meaning and purpose might have different relationships in different countries as well. So meaning is probably always relevant to a degree, but you also can't focus on meaning if you're hungry. So it may be different in less developed countries. So it's really interesting to see how closely connected it is with life satisfaction, which fits my prior belief. So in short, I would like to look at it more, and we'll hope to do so in the not too distant future. We just have some data limitations.
Right. I look forward to future conversations. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you both. I think one of the wide critiques of happiness research and even positive psychology and well-being as a whole is that the research and the practice oftentimes focuses on the few and the privileged versus those who can't access. And then we have these paradoxes, for example, Bhutan, where the GDP could be considered low, but their gross national happiness is high. And so these are the different forces that we're sort of exploring. And I think what makes the Flourishing Index unique as a construct is that it integrates economic stability as opposed to just the traditional metrics of what we might consider, hedonic happiness in popular culture. So pleasure-oriented happiness versus eudaimonic or eudaimonic happiness around purpose and meaning. So certainly, Kelsey, making a great point in terms of longitudinal studies, having the impact of the resources at hand, and then looking at those higher order needs. Really, really important. So thank you for that question, Paul. Any other thoughts or questions? I know, Jacob, you've been patient. You had a burning question. You came on earlier to share. Would you like to reiterate that, or Kelsey address it?
Yeah, I think it was actually very similar to the previous question. I just wanted to kind of know exactly like what methods were used to tie social welfare programs to the increase in happiness, because like the previous question asker was saying, like there's just so much going on with development, and there are things that are happening simultaneously in all these countries that are developing. So how exactly are you isolating the effect of social welfare programs as the cause of the increase in happiness when there's so much else going on? Like, what are you controlling for? What are the methods? I'm an academic, so I'm just really curious about the nitty-gritty of it, but it might not be appropriate for this call.
I can respond, again, try to be quick. So nice question. We use different approaches in different studies. So there's one study where you might think of the results as being more causal. And so we use a instrumental variable approach in that case. And we can talk further offline to get into some more detail. Part of it is just looking at really the consistency in movement over time. So we have in another study, we have this long time horizon. And you can see the measures they move quite closely together using, I'm trying to avoid the terms, just accounting for fixed characteristics of the countries. And then relatedly, two people pointed out that it seems that the welfare state programs are likely to help people at the bottom, let's say reduce suffering as opposed to increase happiness. And they're right. But when you reduce suffering at the national level, it also is picked up in the life satisfaction scale. So it increases it on average. Inequality was another thing that was raised. And so I can say that the evidence is not as convincing with inequality, which is a bit surprising. Some of that is depending on the country context that you look at. So just to respond to a couple of questions real quick. And there's another one I can say, but I'll pass it back to Noemi.
Yeah, we should definitely talk offline about inequality, because I have some thoughts about that, because that's a very complicated issue. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, we'll definitely send out information and resources to continue to connect. And I think in a future session, we'll talk more on inequality and Gini coefficients and explore that in greater details, because it is a worthwhile conversation. Absolutely. Thank you. So I am seeing a lot of comments in the chat around the power of storytelling. And I'm curious to know how the story has shifted for you as you listen in on this call. And I'd love to invite any global shapers who are on the call to share their thoughts. So the Global Shapers is an initiative with the World Economic Forum to empower young people with a seat at the table. And we know that it's important to empower voices as well. And so I know we have some master storytellers who are working in government here on the call today. So I just want to open it up if you feel moved to share any thoughts. I know one person's in an airport, so it might not be easy.
Hi, hello. How are you, Noemi?
Hi, Christy.
I'm Christy Borelli. I'm a global shaper from Trinidad and Tobago. Yes, I think one of the most exciting aspects of this for me would be how this, this data gets translated into story, as some of the other participants are saying. Because the way we translate is so important for corporations to pick up these ideas. And yes, but I've really just been listening in a preliminary way, and I'm happy to be here. Very, very insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Christy does work with Indigenous people and laws and policies to empower them also from an economic perspective. So Christy, thank you for sharing.
Yes.
I'd love to, yes. Okay, Kelsey, yeah. What do we need for this to be accessible, relatable, for people to understand and want to work together? And one theme that I heard a lot that was arising was really a participatory model. So Amanda, you mentioned one of the nations really monitoring and asking their people, what do you think is important in developing this well-being framework? Because well-being and human flourishing is a term that I think people viscerally understand and connect with. So I'd love to hear if you all have any other thoughts, Emmie and Amanda. Amanda, yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so when we were developing the Wellbeing Economy Policy Design Guide, I think that the principle of participation was really core to it, and also trying to find examples and tools and resources that look at that intersection, because I do think that the transformations we need in the economy are really interconnected with the transformations we need in our political systems as well. And one of the things in all of this work, so we've also been piloting this with different governments, and there's always this initial hesitation, right? That it's like, oh, well, people aren't going to know what we should do, right? Like it's going to be too complicated for them, and they're just going to want, candy or sweets or something like this, right? And I think we underestimate people's capacities to really think in systems and to understand what's needed for their sort of context and lived realities. But I think it's also something about the fears around relinquishing control that really is coming up at its heart. So I think when we allow for a genuinely participatory process, not just like one which is let's consult people around a project that we already know the outcome is going to be, right? It forces us to make ourselves really vulnerable to what kind of outcomes are going to come from this. And I think it's an area where I know the OECD has been doing a lot of research on this, and there used to be like just some different participatory initiatives. In the last few years, it's been like exponential, right? So I think the renaissance in economic thinking and the renaissance in sort of political deliberative democracy, we're seeing that all coming together in this moment in time, which is exciting.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you everyone for staying on. I realize we are a minute over. We will hang out for just another 2 minutes for any other thoughts, closing statements, maybe from all of our speakers. And then we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I'm gonna go really rapid fire and invite Emmie, do you have anything you'd like to share as a closing thought or statement?
Just that I think when I'm in this amazing place with all you people, I feel like everyone wants flourishing. But I was at a dinner party on Saturday night where someone told me they were really cross that their school had made kindness a value. I was like, how can you be cross about that? And he said, because kindness gets you nowhere. And he's in charge of, like, he's high up in finance. He said, it gets you nowhere, you'll get trodden on. It's the wrong thing. We can't tell our children that because that's not the way the world is. So it just reminded me that we have to make people realize the world is different. Otherwise, they're going to keep reinforcing this cycle of standing on other people and trampling on them. And yeah, we need to change the story.
definitely poignant example of that. Thank you so much, Emmie, and thank you for everyone for helping us change the dialogue there. Kelsey, any closing thoughts?
I would like to encourage everyone to engage with somebody who might disagree. I have a feeling that we're preaching to the choir, and to borrow Bonita's language here. People and our views are our assets. So let's invest in ourselves and the future.
Powerful. Thank you, Kelsey. Bonita.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, Noemi. Those are wonderful thoughts, and I'm really excited that this group is meeting to talk about actual measurement that we can do that will move the group forward. It's one thing to come and provide a lot of hope and inspiration. It's another to actually take on systemic issues and build communities and platforms that help people to prosper. And so it's exciting to see a group that's going to do that.
Thank you all so much. So I'll just open it up if you have any closing thoughts or words. I'm seeing comments in the chat. Thank you for people tuning in, even from Japan. Thank you, Memi, for joining us. Thanks for all our speakers, and we will continue the conversation and send out the recording. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, Noemi.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Noemi.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Kelsey.
you.
Thanks, Bonita. Bye,
Thank you.
Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Emmie.
Bye.